Hello, Stephen White, Steve Arts 89. Just having a look at the Star Trek Classic UK comics, which were reprinted by IDW and the Library of American Comics a few years ago. This is volume 2 from 1970 to 72. There's nothing on the inside of the there's no cover work. It's just a dust cover and a black book. Now the only issue that I have with these is they had this big glossary or whatever, which took up pages and pages that you had to wade through to get to the actual art. Now, why on earth they didn't put this at the back where you can look at it if you want to? You have to sort of get through it to get to the actual comics. And much like the other one, they collect the individual comics because they were stories told over weeks, different issues in different weeks. Not like the American ones where you mostly get a whole story in one comic, or at least longer comics, so it's less comics to string a story over. These strung them over quite a lot of issues. Like you can see there's 65 to 73, 95 to 100. And often they get the cover and a page or 2 pages within the magazine, like TV21 or Joe 90 and some of those sort of UK ones where you get one book would have a whole different bunch of stories from different characters and shows or licensed properties. And yeah, you get a magazine each week or fortnight or month, and they'd have a page in each one, not like the newspaper strips that would have each day you get a little strip of each of different characters. So, yep, so you get a cover, a couple of pages. Now, the artwork was a bit inconsistent. When they started off, they did double page spreads in the centre, and they're quite beautiful. Then they went to single page, which is a lot better to reproduce here, but sometimes the art was very different and not as accurate. Now, by this point, some of the artists, I think, had more access to the show, because these went these were printed before the show was on TV in the UK. And a lot of the artists, like with Gold Key, were working with very little source material. And I think the appeal with these, just like the other one, like the Gold Key and that, is that they're very far out. They don't sort of adhere to the regular Star Trek show, both in freedom because they don't have budgets and issues and restraints on that level, but also they just wrote whatever science fiction story. Wherever the story went, they seem to just go. After a while, I think they can't reined it in a little bit, but in the beginning it was the Wild West. And it's very interesting, some of the stuff they did. Stuff you'd sort of imagine would happen when you're a kid before you kind of are old enough to understand how Starfleet would really work. So there's good and bad to that. They're kind of ridiculous, but once you kind of accept that, they're a lot of fun. But yes, like, look at the Enterprise. But the DC comics in the 80s were just as bad. They had a lot of weird looking Enterprises that apparently all the same ships supposedly, but they always look different. So I guess I'm just doing these videos because, you know, if you don't have this volume and you're interested in it, you can basically see what's in here, and you can be sure if this is something you want or something you're going to enjoy looking at, or just have a little sneak peek without actually having to have your own copy. So I'm just going to go through every page and waffle on. Now, I don't know a lot about the history. I just know that it was a licensed property. They were wanting to promote the show, launch the show in the UK and promote the show after it had finished in America. I think in '69, around the time it finished or after it finished. They sold it to America much like they sold it to Britain or UK, much like they sold it to the rest of American syndication, which is where it really gained its most popularity, because unfortunately NBC or whoever owned it at the time, the original run of Star Trek, they showed it at fairly bad times and it didn't reach as many people as it could. It certainly reached more than the myth would suggest, and it rated a lot better than people give it credit for, but it just cost too much and they didn't understand it. so they cancelled it. Not because it was unpopular as the myth was created. Now, this also reprints some of the stories that were printed in annuals, which some were created for the annuals, and some are more traditional storybook formats. Others were just comics printed in them. And again, different artists, they all vary. And this is one of the ones I saw. I remember seeing one like this with that banner at the top, that one of my brothers had from, I think, the 70s. And I just found an old pile of comics and things, stuff like Valiant and Joe 90 and TV21. Those are the kind of books that we read in the UK. I don't know if you're watching this video, if you're from America or local or whatever, anyone who's watching this from anywhere around the world. I'd found one, and that was when I realised that they were even made, but I didn't know they went on this long and were this extensive. I thought they'd just done a couple of random promotional little comic strips here and there. But yeah, it ran for years and years and years. Yeah, a full decade, 69 to 79, which was when Star Trek had really owned sci-fi for a while there, before Star Wars came out. And then when Star Wars came out, it was hugely popular, but it was still just one film. You could see it over and over again, I guess, but it only occupied so much time, whereas Star Trek was on every night. So even after Star Wars, it still held its place for a while, which is why Star Trek the Motion Picture happened, in part, because they were going to do a TV series, and they didn't do the TV series. They were going to do a TV movie at first, then a TV series, then they went back to a TV movie, then Star Wars came along, so they decided to do a movie and probably motion picture, and I think the TV series was 3 weeks before about to go into production, and a lot of the pre-production work was done. They cancelled it, went ahead with Star Trek the Motion Picture, used a lot of the elements from some of the production work and a story called The God Thing, reworked that, and that's how we end up with that. But the comics sort of kept the show alive as well as the reruns. That's what I sort of discovered later. And that's just an ad for the next volume, and the US comic book newspaper comics that I was talking about before. And let's look at the back. Just a little sample of some of the art on the back. Not a lot of information. And I guess I'll do the third volume as well, because I think I can get that in one video. I spent a bit more time looking at the art in the first volume, so I just did that as one video. So this is 72 to 79. And it's the exact same format, and the same thing that bugged me. Again, this, is it a glossary or? It's just abbreviations and just anything. It's like a encyclopedia in 2 parts. And that's cool, because it does help you understand what you're looking at and what it all means. But stick it at the back so you don't have to wade through it to get to the actual comics. I mean, I seriously have thought about removing the pages so I don't have to look at it, but unfortunately that's printed on the other side, so you can't really do that. Now again, we have the stories lumped together, and you know, you can actually just jump to the start of a new story and all that, but continue on the same style as before. The journey continues, and I don't know, every week little kids in the UK got their little dose of Star Trek, along with Star Trek being in syndication on TV, and it gave it a life that sadly it could have had in prime time if they had produced the show, kept producing it, put it on at an early time, known its audience, respected its audience. They did demographics after Star Trek. They didn't have a huge amount of viewers, and it cost a lot of money, but what they found out later was the amount of the viewers that they did have were all young males, which is of course the target demographic. once they realised that, they were very happy to force it into syndication when it didn't have a lot of episodes. Normally you'd have to have 100. They had 79 or 78, but they still did it anyway. What can I say? We could have had primetime Star Trek for probably way more than 3 years if they... I think the story is they tried to sabotage the show. They put it on at bad times. They they had to get its ratings down a little bit so they could justify cancelling it, because they didn't want to spend the money on the show, because in theory they could produce a cheaper show and get similar ratings, because it wasn't the highest rating show purely by numbers. They didn't understand the demographic at the time. They didn't start doing them apparently until 1970. Or at least didn't look at Star Trek's demographics until after the show had been cancelled. Apparently it was actually there was talk of other studios taking it over, and they kept the sets up for about 6 months, but by the time something was put together, they'd waited a fair while, but they eventually tore the sets down, and with the cost of recreating all the sets and everything again, it was too much for another studio to take it over, and it stayed cancelled. So Star Trek had a lot of close calls. It could have kept going if a few different things had happened. If they'd kept it at its original slot, or even brought it down an hour earlier so younger children could see it, like 7:30 instead of 8:30, 9:30. Eventually it went to the deaf slot. I think it was 10:30 or something on Friday or something. Which that's usually what studios do. Networks do. If they want a show to die, they put it on the deaf slot. It'll take a bump, and they say, "Oh, we've lost audience, we've lost ratings. It's in decline. It's going down. We have to cancel it." When really, they won't do it anyway. They did the same thing with Ellen. After she came out, they moved her around, and then that affected the ratings, and then they used the ratings as justification to cancel the show. They did it with Murder, She Wrote, because the show rated really well, but it was an older demographic they didn't like, because they didn't respect an older audience. Apparently their money doesn't matter. And they had Friends, so they put Friends in Murder, She Wrote spot, moved her. She only lost a small amount of audience, but then she said, "If you move me, I'm not coming back." And they moved her, and she kept her word and did not return for a 13th season or whatever. So good for her. But it's an old trick the networks have. So Star Trek had a lot of, it was nearly cancelled every year. It had writing campaigns which convinced them that there was an audience out there that cared about the show, because they didn't think there was. And that kept it alive for 2 seasons. But they didn't get a 3rd season. And it's a pity, because I think had they stayed on air long enough for the moon landing, it would have helped even if they hadn't put it in a better slot. Now, I think this is one of the annuals, because they are spread out within here. There's annuals and specials and things that are included, as well as the weekly comics. And again, the art is wildly inconsistent, but some of it is really fun. And there's a sense of variety. You never know what you're going to get from week to week, from story to story, and when you're looking through something like this from page to page. Some of it's beautiful. I mean, God, look at that picture of Spock there. How great is that? A lot of, it's funny, the Transformers artwork was very similar. The UK was much different from the American. And the American artists used to make fun of the UK artists, basically saying they were like kids playing with water paint and finger paints, because they used water paint and inks to colour the comics, which looked far superior to Americans' 4-colour dot process. And that's the end. Now I have a cover gallery, because a lot of the time Star Trek got the cover, even if it only had 2 pages on the inside. Not every issue. Some issues had other characters and other stories on the cover, but Star Trek often got the cover. And these are, I think they're all reproduced here. Would have been fun if they just included these inside along with the artwork, but it sort of works on its own. And there's a few little extras at the end, tie-ins, ads. I still want that toy. And the motion picture Klingon and Enterprise toys, which I didn't really know existed till years later. Badges. Different comics created to promote different things. And this one's beautiful. This one, obviously it isn't vintage, but it was done in relation to the Klingon and US Enterprise guides, which are done like the car manuals, I mean. And then of course we have ads for the other comics, which you've just seen in my other videos. And like the others, the back just gives a little selection of art and just a hint of what you're going to get inside. So hopefully you got something from those. I really am glad they did them. I greatly enjoyed looking at them. I love having them, and I'm really going to enjoy sitting down and reading them in the near future. So thanks for having a look at that. Hopefully you got something out of that, and you might even get them yourself. Thanks. Bye.